Today is all about the Italian Renaissance, and this is a really exciting time because the world has really started to shift and change. It is with the Italian Renaissance that art for Western society really starts to shift and change. And what I mean by Western society is the societies that are influenced the most by ancient Greek and Roman and ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures. All of those together sort of throughout millennia shape and become what is known today as Western society. And they generally base their government structures and their civilization around democracy. And that is a very loose way to sort of define what a Western society is. You know, we have Western societies versus Eastern, and Eastern societies are more like Asia and Russia and India and cultures like that. Western societies also are more developed around Christian beliefs or Jewish beliefs or even Muslim beliefs, the beliefs that come out of the religion that started with the ancient Jewish text, which transformed into the ancient Christian text, and of which the same religion grew and created the Islam culture. So all of that combined, and it's definitely more complex than that, but all of that combined sort of shifts and creates the Western culture. And so the Italian Renaissance also changes a lot of things in the way that the Christianity works. Catholicism was really, really huge. It was the big religion that sort of dominated Italy and France and England during this time period. Parts of Spain, obviously, that was really important in Spain and Spanish culture. And it was really important, of course, in Spain because we know that Christopher Columbus was sent by the Spanish king and queen in the late 1400s to take his ships and to go discover something on the other side of the world, right? And he landed, and we in 1492, and we say that he discovered the United States. Of course, we know now that people have lived on the continent of the United States and Middle America and South America for thousands of years. And it was just that with this sort of colonialism that started in the late 1400s really began to shift and change, obviously, the culture and everything that was going to happen after that point in that part of the world, in our part of the world. And so we know that Catholicism was a huge part of all of these cultures in this area. But that also starts to change in the 1500s through the 1600s, and we'll talk about that with the next lecture, which surrounds Baroque art. So let's dive into the Italian Renaissance and learn some of the major ideas and points that come out of the Italian Renaissance, what starts the Italian Renaissance, who the most influential artists are, and all of that. So here's some things to remember. We want to first talk about the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. The Renaissance is broken up into two parts: the early Renaissance from 1400 to 1480, and the high Renaissance from about 1480 to 1550. We're going to define humanism. We'll look at two sculptures of the David, so we'll have to talk about who David is and why this sculpture might be really important, and that particular character might be important. And we'll define linear perspective and Neoplatonism. So let's start with the Black Death. The Black Death has come around about three different times in the history of the world. The first time was around the 400s to 500s. We see it again in around 1430s to 1448, okay? This is the bubonic plague. The third time that it showed up was in the 1700s. But it was during this time that it actually wreaked the most havoc, and that you learn about it the most sort of through movies or books are written about it, this time period, because it killed about 25 million people. A quarter of the population died in Europe during this time period. So that was a huge shift in society, and we'll talk about that. And so the Black Death arrives in Sicily around 1348, and it quickly spreads north. So Sicily is a little island south of Italy. And so it arrives there, and through ships, etc., it spreads quickly north. And the bubonic plague was carried by rats. At this time period in 1348, life was centered around what is called feudalism, and feudalism was the dominant social system in medieval Europe, in which the nobility held lands from the crown in exchange for military service, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants or serfs were obliged to live on their lord's land and give them homage, labor, and a share of the produce nationally in exchange for military protection. So that's sort of the formal definition of feudal rule. Feudalism lasted for hundreds of years in medieval Europe. Life was not very sanitary during this time period. Life wasn't really sanitary until the 1900s come about. People were very dirty, and it was hard to keep things clean, and rats and bugs and cockroaches and just all of those kinds of rodents were everywhere. No population was safe from the bubonic plague. And what happened is that it really killed a lot of people, right? I said 25 million people or so, and you'll see different numbers as you look across the internet, how many people actually died from the bubonic plague. So if you're mostly farmers and laborers, right, there is no real market. People are not selling things at markets during feudal rule, okay? They were laborers, they were farmers, they grew things, and they gave it right to the lords of the land. And so most of the people die, and they have an influx of workers to the city, which led to more manufacture and trade, as well as a growing intellectual class. So that's a real takeaway from this time period. It took a couple decades for the bubonic plague to really spread through and kill this massive amount of population. So of course it took another several decades for the change in society to happen, but it did happen, and it changed the governmental structure. Feudalism left, and it turns, especially in Italy, it becomes more of what we might consider capitalism, where you have people, creating shoes and clothing and selling it in markets. People are farming and taking it to market so that other people can purchase it from them. So it really changes the way that their society runs. And it also results into a more growing intellectual class, and academies are created, and schools. And so it results in a rebirth of classical values. Something else happened. So before the bubonic plague hits, this guy named Petrarch, he creates a philosophy called humanism. Humanism is a belief in the unique value of each person. And that was very different, right? Because in feudalism, everyone kind of works together, and they work in support of the land. Let's say they're producing goods, they're sharing it, and they're giving it to the lords and ladies of the land. But humanism is this idea that you as an individual have value. That's very different. He taught that the study of classical languages, literature, history, and philosophy could lead to a new and enlightened stage of history. So all of these ideas were floating around in the ether. People who could read were allowed to read this information. It was starting to change the way people thought about themselves and their place in society. And these ideas as well were a huge break from what the Catholic Church was teaching at the time, because everything that the Catholic Church was teaching was that, you owe everything you have to the service of God. So you really didn't need to do anything outside of the service of God. But what humanism taught was that you could actually do more, study language and literature and read books and learn about history and the world around you, and learning to understand your place in this sort of bigger world. The church really didn't like that, but it was a huge philosophy that was taking over a lot of the way people were thinking. And eventually you'll see that the Catholic Church decides to sort of integrate these ideas into their teaching. But humanism teaches it was no longer God's will, what an individual was capable of, that people could choose what they wanted to be in all their glory and beauty. To explore these ideas, artists look to the classical past for artistic references. So what classical past did they look to? They looked to classical Greek sculpture with all of its beauty and perfection of the ideal human form. They also looked to ancient Greek philosophy, like Plato, to understand and ponder life and nature itself. So all of this together, the bubonic plague, along with humanism, looking to the classical past, all culminates into what we understand now as the Italian Renaissance, a rebirth of classical values. This statue demonstrates that classical influence as the first freestanding nude male sculpture created since antiquity. Antiquity means a time before the fall of Rome, and the fall of Rome was around just before 500 Common Era. So that's a long time. It's been almost 1,000 years since we have had a first freestanding nude male sculpture to be created since antiquity. So that's why we're looking at this early Renaissance sculpture called David by the artist Donatello. This is made in 1425 to 1430. It's bronze. The height is 5 feet and 2 1/4 inches, and it's at the Museo Nazionale del Bargello in Florence, Italy. You'll see that Florence, Italy, was sort of the heart of the Italian Renaissance. Donatello's David was rendered in contrapposto, as in the classical posing. What else did we learn that used the contrapposto stance? That would be the spear bearer from ancient classical Greek sculpture. Donatello's David seems to be self-admiring. He's standing very confidently, but he does look young. He looks not as muscular, let's say, as the spear bearer, but still a very slight, slim physique. The sculpture depicts the boy David. David, who is he? David eventually becomes a king, but when he's a boy, his famous story is that he takes down someone called a Goliath, and David was trying to save his people from a big monster called the Goliath, and a monster in the sense of just a big bad guy who was trying to destroy his people. And David was Jewish. And so this is a real big story for the Jewish culture, but it also is a part of the Old Testament of the Christian and Catholic Bible. And so David was a young boy. He is protecting his townsfolk, his people, from this Goliath. He uses a slingshot, but a slingshot is a little different in these days. His slingshot is not the kind that you pull back with a rubber band, but more like something that you spin and throw. And he destroys and kills the Goliath. And so it's a story of the small, meek, pure, and childlike, right? Innocent, can take down and defeat a huge monster that obviously is overpowered, but through the will of God and through his cunning, David is able to destroy and defeat the Goliath. So that's the story of David. And we see the David sculpted here. We'll see it 2 more times because it's a very popular theme in art. The boy David is the epitome of youth and beauty. His features, for example, are delicate and refined and framed by shoulder-length curls of hair. David languidly smiles, looking completely at ease in his contrapposto stance. This emphasis on his age and looks symbolically infers his goodness and shows that he won not through physical strength, but because of God. That is how Donatello wanted the viewers of that time period to interpret his sculpture of the David. And the hat that he's wearing is very typical of the time period as well. So we see that influence of what they, at the time, would have been modern Florentine fashion. And notice that David in this is also not carrying a slingshot, but has a sword, and there's also a shield at his feet. Okay, let's look at something really important in early Renaissance, which is linear perspective, and we're going to study a lot about this in class. Early medieval painters, before actually 1430s, they really did not understand how to paint and draw using linear one-point perspective. And we see that as an example here. This is just one painting. This is a painting called The Annunciation of the Death of the Virgin. And so what that means is that this angel is annunciating that Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, is going to die. And that's the story that's taking place in this painting. It is by the painter Duccio, and it's tempera on panel. It's 16 inches by 21 inches, and it is in Milan, Italy. It was painted between 1308 and 1311. And so what we see here is the real painting over here on the left. And on the right-hand side, the white lines are showing us the bad perspective. They really didn't understand how to create one perspective to make it look realistic, like they were in an illusionistic space. And also notice the background. When you look through the doors and archways, there is no nature involved. We're not seeing a landscape out there. And that changes with the early Renaissance. There is an artist named Filippo Brunelleschi. He develops a system of geometric linear perspective. And you're going to want to watch this video about how linear perspective works. And we will watch some of it as a class as well. And I will walk you all through how to draw in linear perspective and create a room using one-point linear perspective. But the painter Masaccio, he incorporated what he learned from Brunelleschi to create artworks such as the tribute money. The tribute money, someone is offering a tribute to Jesus. Jesus is standing here in the middle, and you have all of his disciples sort of surrounding him. We see a bunch of changes from the painting from Duccio that we saw a moment ago to this Masaccio painting. We have an entire landscape. This is the influence of humanism and also what we are going to call Platonism or Neoplatonism, which we'll define later. We're seeing that integration and combination of nature included with the people. We are also seeing an element of linear perspective. It still is not perfect. It still is sort of like a flattened space. It doesn't really look very realistic. But there is a sense they are really trying, the artists are trying to show us something that looks more realistic, like we're looking through a window onto something that could exist outside our window. And you have the building on the right-hand side, which has pretty good one-point perspective. It's not quite right, but the lines do practically meet up in the center of the painting. Another difference is that the people are sort of not stacked on top of one another, as we'll see in other medieval works of art, but they are behind one another, as though they are actually all standing in that same space. And all of their faces are individualized, and none of them are covered up, so it's very clearly important for Masaccio, the painter, to show us these faces. And Jesus is in the middle. We also see the contrapposto stance of this figure in the foreground. You can see that his right leg is slightly bent, his shoulders are slightly askew, as well as this guy over here on the far right. He is also standing in contrapposto stance. The person in the background sort of getting water the figure is not totally modeled. It doesn't look perfectly proportioned. They're still sort of working that out. At this time period, they're beginning to study the human anatomy and studying cadavers to learn from, and actually also learning about and studying from models in the studio. So artists are beginning to understand the body and how it looks underneath all of those robes a little bit better to paint it more realistically. Masaccio's painting called The Tribute Money was painted in 1427. It's a fresco. So far I mentioned tempera on wood, and then this is called a fresco. Frescoes are painted where pigment is mixed with plaster, and that plaster is painted onto the wall so that the painting becomes a part of the room. It becomes a part of the wall. Tempera is really, really common during the Middle Ages. Tempera is pigment mixed with an egg-based binder, and it really lasts for millennia. Tempera paintings are very stable and sturdy, and they don't deteriorate very easily. And tempera is painted on not canvas, not paper, but on a wooden panel. Okay, let's look at another early Renaissance painting. This is from a little bit later. Masaccio's painting was in 1420. Masaccio's painting was in 1427. Brunelleschi had just developed that system of geometric linear perspective, and by 1455, another artist named Piero della Francesca, he is painting the Flagellation of Christ, another Christian story. With this painting from Piero della Francesca of the Flagellation of Christ, we see a real beginning of the Renaissance ideals sort of fully fledged out. We have now a realistic space that looks like an illusionistic space that as though you're looking, at a real building, sort of in a real natural environment. There is one point perspective, as you can see from the columns on the left and in the middle, and everything from the right-hand side to the left-hand side meets at one point in the center of the painting. There is a sense of depth in this painting. We have people sort of in the background. There's Jesus. We have Pontius Pilate or someone else from the biblical story as Jesus is being whipped. That's what flagellation means. It means that he is being whipped. And those people are smaller, they're in the background, and the people in the foreground are much larger, but they are all in the same space. The people in the foreground are standing in contrapposto stance. You can see it very clearly from the man directly in the middle. Everyone has an illusion of volume to their bodies. They have realistic facial features, and their hair on their heads is all individualized. And in the background, we don't see an empty void, but we have nature. Nature is being brought into the artistic space. We're including humans, people with nature, and that is a part of that humanistic philosophy again. One other thing that's really important to the Renaissance ideals is sort of an overall general calmness. They are very interested in intellectualism and learning. And so you see that this painting, even though it is of this very horrific moment of Jesus being whipped, and the story is that he was whipped 40 times, 40 lashes. And the idea is that no one could withstand that. And that sort of shows the strength of Jesus, that anyone would die after 10 or 15 lashes, but he withstood 40 lashes. That's how the story goes in the Bible. But we don't see pain and grief and anxiety and drama in this painting. It's very calm and intellectual. And so that pervades this painting, that idea of a lack of drama. They're showing the control over their brains and their minds by not showing us sort of the horror and the drama that may have actually have been felt if you were really being whipped 40 times, right? But we're not seeing that drama in this painting, and that's very intentional. So it's good to point that out. One of the main takeaways of this painting that we want to remember is the advent of oil paint. So we mentioned tempera, we've mentioned fresco, and here we have the advent of oil paint. And that's where the pigment is mixed with the binder of oil. And oil paint is so much better than anything that had preceded it. Oil paint is much more vivid. You can tell the colors in this painting are so bright and vivid and saturated, deep red and blue and greens and golds. I mean, it's just really beautiful. And the color is much more luminous. Oil paint has a luminosity to it that the other types of paint just don't have. And that's why we're looking at Roger van der Weyden's painting called The Deposition, when it's another Christian painting where they're taking Jesus off of the cross after he has been crucified. And this is in Madrid. And in the north, artists desire to render believable space and realistic detail. And so we see a lot of detail in this painting, detail in the texture and the pattern on this person's cloak. All of the folds in the cloth are so beautifully rendered. They really look like they would be soft to the touch, and they follow the shape of the body really, really well. The detail in the woman who's wearing green, and even the detail in her dress. So all of those details are just more easily rendered with the use of oil paint. And the Deposition has nothing emotionally in common with the Flagellation of Christ. This one, people are weeping, people are crying, they are sad. That's a little bit of a difference between the Florentine ideals of intellectualism versus what is going on in the north, where we're seeing a little bit more drama and emotion in the paintings. Okay, what we've all sort of been waiting for. We have the High Renaissance, 1480 to 1450. It's not really a long period of time. The High Renaissance could extend a little bit past that. After about 1550s, the movements in the periods of art start to shift and change a little bit at a quicker pace. And we'll start to see that with the Baroque era. So here we have Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is a name that all of us know pretty well. We understand that he painted the Mona Lisa, which is a very famous painting. We'll see the Mona Lisa a little bit in a couple of weeks. The Last Supper is a very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci. It is a mural. It is oil and tempera mixed with plaster. So Leonardo da Vinci, he experimented a lot. He was a great military mind. He actually painted, but he didn't actually do that many paintings. His paintings only numbered in the 20s. So he really was not a prolific painter. But what he did paint was always revolutionary, always something new that he was trying to do. And his paintings sort of withstand the times. And he was, like I said, a military mind. So he actually worked for the Milan military. He invented the first version of the helicopter. It didn't work. He could never get it to fly, but in his notebooks, he kept copious amounts of notes and did a lot of sketches. And those sketchbooks and notebooks are also preserved and kept in museums in Italy. And in those notebooks, you see sketches for things like helicopters and tanks, military machines. And so here we have the Last Supper, which is another one of his experiments. This is in Milan. It's in the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie. And the Last Supper was an experiment because it was a combination of oil and tempera. And as you can see, it is in disrepair. It was not a good idea, Leo. Like he could have... this is one of his most famous paintings, and I'm sure it was brilliant and beautiful and had a lot of details back in 1495 to 1498 when it was first painted. But over time, it has deteriorated. And so what is this down here at the bottom? This is actually a doorway. So this is painted onto the wall. It can never be taken off the wall and preserved in another type of gallery. Any restorations that have been done to it have only been to clean it. It will never be restored back to its original glory because of the combination of oil and tempera. And it's 15 feet high by 28 feet long, so it's very large. And in order to see this painting, you actually have to make an appointment months and months in advance. It's sort of cordoned off. You can't get very close to it, and there's always a crowd. So Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper depicts Jesus Christ in the middle, along with all of his disciples on the left and the right. There are 6 on the left and 6 on the right. And this is the supper that is famous in the Bible. It depicts sort of his last meal with his disciples before he is betrayed the next morning, I believe, and then he is crucified soon after that. So that's why it's known as the Last Supper. And everyone is very lively. This painting is very lively Last Supper painting. Everyone is in motion. Their hands are all doing different gestures. They're leaning towards one another. They're talking. And there's, as you can see, that going all the way across all of the disciples. Then Jesus in the middle has his hands outstretched, and he is calm and showing sort of his calm presence. This does seek to show proportion and balance. It is in perfect one-point linear perspective, and it all goes to a point behind the head of Jesus. Light and nature are behind Jesus's head to show that he is one with light and nature, and that nature is not separate from being human. There's realistic body and movement and hand gestures. All of the faces are distinct and differentiated. It also has a use of real and implied lines. All of these lines meet to a point behind Jesus, and it's all sort of split. It's very split down the middle and very balanced and symmetrical. So keep all of that in mind as you are looking at Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Another famous artist from the High Renaissance is Raphael. Raphael painted something called the School of Athens. You can see a large version of it here. Raphael arrived in Florence during a time of Neoplatonist domination. Neoplatonism is the study of Plato and Platonism. Platonism was derived during the 400s, 500s, and part of the early medieval age. In Florence, Italy, Platonism was combined with mysticism and Christianity, and it is Neoplatonism, very specific to this time period. Art begins to exceed reality rather than imitate it. The School of Athens is the most famous of Raphael's paintings in this room in the Vatican. It is the Stanza della Segnatura. I'm not very good at pronouncing these Italian names. I do have a link in the PDF about more information about Vatican City and how it began. And when you look up the Stanza della Segnatura of the Vatican, you can actually see the entire room and all of the paintings that Raphael did in that room. When he created this painting, the School of Athens, it was painted in 1510 to 1511. It is also a fresco, and it's very large and fills up an entire wall of the room. He was 28 years old. Plato and Aristotle split the center. Plato and Aristotle were Greek philosophers of ancient Greece. The High Renaissance sought to create a feeling of balance and proportion. We heard that when I was speaking about Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and you hear it again here, balance and proportion. The Greek philosopher Plato argued that painting was a mere imitation of an already existed thing. But Neoplatonists flipped this argument upside down. They wanted art to exceed reality. Art was a window not just to nature, like what things looked like, but a window to the divine itself. This is a portrayal of the greatest philosophers, mathematicians, and artists up to this time, according to the Neoplatonists. Plato is on the left, pointing upward toward spiritual ideas, and Aristotle is pointing down because he was concerned with the matter-of-factness of material reality. A couple of things to point out, besides the fact that it has Greek sculptures in the background and Greek sort of in this beautiful white marble, everything is in one-point perspective. You have a real sense of the physicality of people's bodies. The proportions are correct. The folds and drapery really follow the shape of the human form. This person down here in the front is actually the artist Michelangelo, who we are going to look at next. And this little face over here on the right-hand side is a self-portrait of Raphael himself. You can see that there are different conversations and arguments going on all throughout this painting, all having to do with, here's arguing over geometry. They're probably arguing and sketching, his leg is crossed, and they are very much engaged on the right and on the left in what the conversation is that Aristotle and Plato are having in the center. So there's a lot to learn about in this painting. It is really beautiful, and it's amazing to see in real life. Again, just like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, we have a doorway. So this part right here that's sort of blocked out on the bottom left is a doorway. So you can tell that when you're looking at this painting, you are looking up slightly above head level, and you are looking at a very large fresco painting. Michelangelo is one of the last artists we're going to look at from the Italian Renaissance. He is part of the High Renaissance. Michelangelo was a painter and a sculptor, and we have a lot of his sculptures in Florence, Italy, at the Academy, which is where this particular sculpture is. And he also did paintings in Rome in the Vatican as well. So let's go ahead and look at this sculpture. The sculpture is similar to the David sculpture by the artist Donatello, but this one was made about 75 years later. Renaissance ideals have become widespread throughout the region of Italy. The artists have begun to create paintings, sculptures of people that are more glorious, grand, and muscular, and more perfect than reality. For reference, just look at Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is going to be in a couple of slides. Look closely at the human figures and how massive and powerful the human body has become in the High Renaissance paintings and sculptures. This sculpture is no different. The sculpture represents the story of David, who is supposed to be a young man, who, without armor, defeats the horrible military leader Goliath and saves his people. David in this sculpture is in classic contrapposto stance. He is looking over his left shoulder with his furrowed brow in concentration, his right hand beginning to tense as it is about to take action against Goliath. History tells us that Michelangelo actually understood human anatomy very well because he was able to be privy to dissections and scientific research at the time to learn the structures of the human body, the muscle tone, and skeletal structure. The city government of Florence commissioned Michelangelo to sculpt the David. They loved it so much that they placed it in front of the Signoria, which is the government building in Florence. Now it is in the Accademia of Florence, which is an old art school, now museum. This sculpture is over 14 feet tall. He is monumental as a show of power for the renowned Republic of Florence. We will see that the Renaissance ideals are different, if not contrary, to the art that prevails 100 years later in the Baroque era. Michelangelo also painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. On the next slide, I have a link to view inside the Sistine Chapel. It is awesome. You get to see all of the walls, the floor, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and zoom in and look really close at all of the details. So I really encourage you to take a look at that. You also can click on the link to a virtual tour. The reason for that is that no one is allowed to actually take pictures while they're inside the Sistine Chapel. So all of the pictures that we have of it are allowed and sort of copywritten by the Vatican. This is one picture of the Sistine Chapel. It's a fresco painted on the ceiling by Michelangelo and his assistants. It begins with the creation of the world and ends with the story of Noah and the flood. The first painting was Noah, but as he looked at it, he realized that the Noah's Ark details were too small, and thereafter decided to paint all of the figures much larger and more expressively so that from the floor, as you looked up, you could see the beauty and all of the details of his painting. I have a couple of slides here talking about women of the Italian Renaissance. I want you to click on the link to learn a little bit more about women in the Italian Renaissance. There are some images and a little bit of information to read. Women were painters during this time, but they were systematically left out of the history books. So that's why we recognize the names of Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci. We know them also because in American society they were immortalized as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, of course. But they're also really well known in the history books. They have been written about since the time that they painted, and they are still written about today. But women were also painters during this time. Unfortunately, the majority of the painters, women who painted at this time, were left out of the history books because of patriarchy. And art historians often wrongly attributed works by women to famous men instead. Wealthy women could paint as a way to attract a suitor to marry. Wealthy women could paint if you were able to be sent to a nunnery to become a Catholic nun. You would learn to read and to possibly paint. So there were ways for women to learn how to do these things. And this is kind of similar to men as well. They had to be sort of part of the upper crust of society. People who are a little bit more wealthy and well off could learn how to paint. And that was very, very true of women, because the majority of women, if they were well off enough to learn how to read or to learn a craft, it was generally going to be something suited more toward raising a family. And you didn't really need to learn to paint in order to raise children. Often women who did learn to paint, were able to do that because their fathers also were painters. And so it was hard to become a painter as a woman back 400 or 500 years ago, but they did exist. And I want to show one who was a Catholic nun, an artist. Her name is Platilla Nelli. And this is her version of the Last Supper from around 1570. And you can see that it is a little bit in a similar style to other Last Supper paintings that we have seen before. The last thing to point out is that you can click this link here to see a version of this painting before it was restored. So that's a whole other part of art that we haven't really talked about, but restoration of old artworks is a career choice. You learn how to paint, you learn how to restore it, you work in a museum and learn how to restore old paintings. And when you click on that link to see the before and after, it's quite remarkable, the disrepair that this particular painting was in, and now it is restored to its former glory, as it probably looked in 1570. Platilla Nelli's success was such that Vasari included Nelli as one of only 4 women among over 100 artists in his book called Lives of the Artists from 1550. Vasari notes that she is a, quote, nun and now prioress, who is, quote, beginning little by little to draw and imitate in color pictures and painting by excellent masters, end quote. Vasari also notes that she could have been one of the greatest painters in the world if only she could have studied mathematics and anatomy as male artists did, something that was forbidden to women at the time, and especially a nun. You'll recall Giorgio Vasari is mentioned in the video on linear perspective. He wrote the book called Lives of the Artists from 1550, and the book served as the building blocks for future books about art history.